Old-fashioned murder and mayhem. Murder in the Family, Edward Boothby Cox, 1909. It was a little past 11 o'clock p.m. on the evening of July 12, 1909, as Arthur Meade, a traveling salesman, walked along Firebrace Street near Sinclair's Corner in Horsham, Victoria, Australia, when he was met by a sobbing woman asking frantically where she might find a policeman. Meade asked what the trouble was, and she stated that someone had just rushed into the shop and killed her husband. He immediately turned around and headed back to the Hennessy Hotel, where they located Constable Black, who recognized Miss Martha Cox at once. Shaking and crying, the woman blurted out that she was at the shop counting cash when a man came into the general store and asked for cigarettes. She thought he was someone from Kwantong, a rural area in the Waimea region where the Coxes had previously lived. To her horror, the man suddenly rushed into the back where her husband Ed was and killed him. She saw Ed fall to the floor as the man ran out. Constable Black and Sergeant Keneally accompanied Miss Cox back to the crime scene. Curiously, the shop was dark and eerily quiet. They lit a gas lamp and found 51-year-old Edward Boothby Cox lying dead on the floor. There was a gash on the right side of his temple and other marks of a blunt object on his head and torso. There was also evidence an attempt had been made to clean blood from the body and the floor. Welcome to another episode of Old-Fashioned Murder and Mayhem. I am your host, Mindy Hudson, bringing you tales of historic true crime and scandal with a twist of genealogy. Today's story, A Murder in the Family, Edward Boothby Cox, differs from most of my podcasts in that it occurred in Victoria, Australia. Listener Geni and Kelepouris of Australia wrote to ask me to investigate a story passed down in her grandmother's family about a murder involving her ancestor. I found the story compelling, and with the help of Jeannie's previous research and her father Mark's documents, I sought to discover everything I could about what happened that Monday night, July 12, 1909. Martha Caroline Dorothea Eltze was born in November 1881 in Nadimuk, Australia, a town in western Victoria. She was the youngest daughter of Wilhelm Eltze and Rosina Wilhelmina Hinneberg. The Eltze family were of Jewish descent, but converted to the Lutheran faith when they migrated to Poland and Germany, fleeing persecution. They lived in the Mecklenburg region until the early 19th century when they left war-torn Germany for Australia, arriving there about 1845. Wilhelm Eltze settled in Nadimuk, about 300 kilometers, or 186 miles for us Americans, northwest of Melbourne. Martha Eltze's Jewish heritage was evident in her exotic dark hair and eyes. She was an attractive girl. Martha's mother passed away in 1894 when Martha was only 13. Her father, who was 64 when she was born, had reached the age of 77 in 1902 when Martha married Edward Boothby Cox. She was 21. He was 44. Cox was the son of William B. Cox and Marion Conroy, who lived in Kwantong. Edward was a fruiter with Kwandong orchards, also called the native peach. It looks more like a cherry with its gorgeous red color and grows on bushes in dry, hot climates like that in southern Victoria. Edward Cox was small, thin, and quiet, and had a clubbed foot, but he was financially established and would be able to provide for Martha. Martha's father, Willem, died in 1907, and Martha, still childless, was restless. The following year, she and Edward sold the orchard and took the money to buy a store in the larger city of Horsham, a few miles east. Before the move, they visited Edward's father, who warned them no good could come of their decision to go. Nevertheless, they followed through with their plans and purchased a fruit and general grocery store on Firebrace Street from Mr. Ellis, where they kept a shop in the front and a residence in the back. The fast-paced life of Horsham was a treat for Martha, who for the first time had the opportunity to mix with people close to her age. Martha found a friend in a young man named Albert Hay. Albert was everything Edward was not: young, handsome, virile, and fun. One of 4 sons born to Robert Hay and Hannah Jenkins, the young man, still living at home with his widowed mother, was working as a blacksmith striker. He soon became a regular visitor to the Cox residence, where he and Martha became drinking buddies as the elder Cox retired early. It isn't easy to understand why Edward Cox allowed the friendship to develop, unless he viewed Martha as a child more than a grown woman. Perhaps the loneliness he observed as she remained childless, possibly an Rh-negative blood issue, caused him to overlook caution signs as his young wife reveled in her newfound merriment. Whatever the reason, the warning of his aged father would prove prophetic. About 3 months after arriving in Horsham, the Coxes hired Harriet Helen Griffiths, a 23-year-old married woman with a 3-year-old son, to help with the housekeeping while Martha worked in the store. Harriet's husband, John Griffiths, worked away at Carter Brothers Sheep Ranch at Glenisla Station in the southern Grampians. So, as part of her employment agreement, Harriet and her son Loris were allowed to live in a small room at the back of the Cox residence. As a domestic servant, Mrs. Griffiths would have been required to keep out of the way unless called upon by her employers. Upon arriving at the murder scene that July evening, the policeman noticed several oddities. First, no lights were burning. According to Martha's statement, she had fled the shop in a hurry to find help when she saw her husband fall. Second, Harriet Griffiths and her child, who had been present in the house at the time of the murder, were not there. Third, very little blood was found. However, upon closer inspection, it was clear that blood had been hastily cleaned from the victim and surrounding areas. The victim's hair was damp, and traces of blood were found spattered together with water around the premises. This led to a more thorough investigation, and the discovery of a bloodied white shirt and other items shoved into a crack in the floor of the shop. A tin bowl with traces of water and blood was also discovered under a counter in the shop. When questioned about the cleanup, Martha insisted she had wasted no time seeking help and suggested that Mrs. Griffiths must have cleaned up the blood. Harriet Griffiths and her son were located next door at the residence of C.J. Pierce, a bootmaker. She claimed to have less knowledge about what had transpired than Martha Cox, but the inspectors noted her nervous demeanor. The police weren't buying it and pressed further. Detective Uren was assigned to interrogate the women, and it soon became apparent the story Martha had relayed didn't add up. Eventually, the women confessed that another person had been present in the house that evening, Albert Hay. With this information, the following timeline of events could be pieced together. On Monday, July 12, 1909, Edward Cox awoke feeling under the weather. He spent most of the day nursing his illness while his wife, Martha Cox, tended to the store, and live-in housekeeper Harriet Griffiths took care of her regular household duties. At around 7 o'clock p.m., Edward decided to retire to bed. Griffiths was in the hallway when she overheard Mr. Cox talking to Mrs. Cox in the dining room. He said he had a bad cold and was going to bed. He asked that a hot brandy be brought to him at 7:30 to help him sleep. Afterward, Griffiths and her son left the residence for a side job, cleaning a nearby office after hours. Returning at around 8:00 p.m., she found 25-year-old Albert Hay, a frequent visitor, seated on the sofa in the dining room with Mrs. Cox. The two were talking and laughing. Mr. Cox was not present. Griffiths continued to her room where she put her 3-year-old son, Loris, to bed. Once he was settled, she returned to the dining room where she sat at the table to write 3 letters. Before completing her task, Mrs. Cox told her to go to the shop and bring her one of the toy guns on display. Griffiths was irritated with the interruption, but got up to obey. Mrs. Cox remarked she wanted to show Albert how little Loris had caught his finger in the toy earlier in the week. As she handed the item to Mrs. Cox, Griffiths remarked, quote, "You two are worse than children," end quote. Griffiths knew the relationship between Mrs. Cox and Hay was inappropriate. She had even seen him kissing her. Whether or not Mr. Cox suspected anything was amiss was unclear. At this point, Loris woke up and began to cry, so Griffiths left to check on the boy. She could still hear the couple giggling and talking. 10 minutes later, at about 10:00 p.m., Griffiths decided to go outside for fresh air and saw Mr. Cox pass her room headed to the dining room. He was wearing a light shirt and dark trousers. Once outside, she overheard raised voices, and Mr. Cox said something about the lights. The couple were probably sitting in the dark once Griffiths went to her room. In the meantime, when Edward Cox came upon the scandalous scene, he and Albert began shouting at one another. Cox called the younger man down for always showing up at the house drunk, which enraged Hay. Martha hopped up to close the shop door so that the embarrassing noise of the quarrel wouldn't reach outside. She saw Griffiths outside and ran to her, nervously saying, "They are fighting," to which Griffiths asked, "Who?" Martha retorted, "Don't be a fool," and began to cry. Hearing the sounds of fighting, Harriet Griffiths called out, "What's the matter?" She thought Mr. Cox answered, "Mind your business." It startled her because he had never spoken to her in that manner. Curtains separated the rooms, giving a measure of privacy. Although Harriet couldn't see what was going on, she could hear the terrible sounds. In his rage, Albert Hay had picked up the toy gun and struck Edward Cox in the face. He then continued to bludgeon the older man about the head and face with the blunt end of the metal gun. The rounded trigger left crescent marks where it struck, and blood was spurting. However, Edward continued to fight his bigger and stronger attacker. Realizing the blows wouldn't do the job, Albert rammed his knee into Edward's back to hold him down on the ground as he strangled him. Martha pleaded with him to let him go, but he would not. This was not the first time Cox and Hay had come to blows, and she had come between them. This time, however, the crazed look in Hay's eyes made her fear he'd strike her too if she stepped between them. Shaken and not wishing to be a part of the domestic upheaval, Griffiths returned to her room to try to keep the scuffling and noise from waking her son. It seemed to go on, and she stuck her fingers in her ears to drown out the sounds. After a while, Martha came to her room and said, "He's done," to which Griffiths replied, "I'll go for the police." But Martha snapped, "You won't. I'm the boss here," and held her down on the bed. When she let go, Harriet jumped up and begged, "For God's sake, for my sake, for your sake, tell Albert to give himself up." Mrs. Cox ignored her and left the room. Griffiths threw herself on her knees and began praying. She could hear the two conspirators shuffling around and the sound of the tin dish. Albert and Martha surveyed the bloody scene. He asked her to help him clean up, but she was angry and horrified. She retorted, quote, "Indeed I will not. I will give you in charge," end quote. Albert began hastily wiping up the blood with whatever was at hand. He went into the kitchen and came back with the tin bowl and washed away the blood from Edward's head and around the body. He missed the splatters that speckled the walls as high as 7 feet. He took the bloodied clothes off Edward and rummaged around in the bedroom, coming back with a dark blue shirt and trousers. Looking around for a way to dispose of the evidence, Hayes spotted a crack in the floor and shoved his blood-stained flannel shirt, Cox's white undershirt, and dark trousers into it. He took the tin bowl, rinsed it, and hid it behind a counter in the shop. He, however, forgot to hide the bloody toy gun and left it on the dining table. Eventually, Harriet Griffiths got up and headed to the kitchen, where she met Martha coming toward her in the hallway. Martha warned her that Albert wasn't gone yet and that she'd better not say anything. She instructed Harriet that if she was forced to admit anything, she was to say that a man rushed in, killed Edward, and rushed back out. Martha said she'd go for the police at midnight. However, at around 11:15 p.m., as soon as she thought Albert was safely away, Martha headed out and came across Mr. Bennett, who led her to the officers. Harriet Griffiths gathered her son and rushed out of the house to seek refuge next door at the Pierce residence. Albert hurried to his house on John Street, cutting through buildings, jumping fences, and dropping blood-soaked evidence along the way. He rapidly climbed into bed and pretended to sleep. It was about 1 a.m. when Officers Black and Keneally appeared at the door. He was roused from bed, and when told he was being arrested for suspicion of the murder of Mr. Cox, replied, quote, "What, is he dead?" end quote. Hayes admitted he had been at the shop around 9 p.m. for a pack of cigarettes, but knew nothing about a murder. The sergeant pointed out that Albert's head was wet, but Hayes said he washed it every night before bed. Keneally asked where the clothes he had worn were, and Hay pointed to a drawer. The clothes there were dry and clean, but Keneally reached over to pick up clothes hanging near the bed. These were stained with mud and blood. In the pocket was a wet and bloodied handkerchief. Hayes's brother David came into the room and identified the clothes as belonging to Albert. At this point, Albert Hay was taken into custody. As officers uncovered more and more evidence on Firebrace Street, Martha Cox saw that the pitiful efforts to cover up the murder had been unsuccessful. She approached Officer Urine and said she wanted to make a statement. She admitted that Albert Hay had been present that evening and was drunk. Her husband Ed was standing in the dining room doorway when he admonished Hay, saying that he was a terror for always getting drunk and that the best place for him to go was home. Hay reacted by striking Cox with the toy pistol and then throwing him to the ground, where he choked him to death. Martha Cox and Albert Hay were taken to the precinct and placed in jail. Both were charged with, quote, having on July 12th at Horsham, with malice aforethought, murdered Edward Boothby Cox, end quote. Albert James Hay was represented by attorney A. W. Flint, and Martha Cox hired J. Bennett. Hay had confessed to killing Edward Cox. However, there was a question about whether the murder was premeditated murder or manslaughter. There was also a question as to the relationship between Mrs. Cox and Hay. Evidence was presented about conversations between the defendants in the jailhouse that appeared to insinuate Hay had made an earlier promise to free Mrs. Cox from her marriage. The most damning evidence was the fact that there had been an attempt to clean the murder scene and to conceal the identity of the slayer. The sensational trial drew large crowds eager to hear the scandalous details of the fascinating love triangle. There was some confusion as to the cause of death. Mr. Cox's autopsy revealed he had an enlarged heart, and it was argued that the excitement of the struggle may have killed him. Despite the deep wounds and blows to the head made by the toy gun, damage to his brain was minimal. The final verdict was that suffocation due to choking caused his death. In the end, Albert Hay was convicted of manslaughter on August 3, 1909, and sentenced to serve 15 years in prison with hard labor. Martha Cox was acquitted for her part, which surprised many people. However, her indictment was for the murder of Edward Cox, and it had not been proven she had done more than been an accessory after the fact, which was not named in the indictment. Following the trial, housekeeper Harriet Griffiths gave birth to another son, Douglas. Her husband, John Griffiths, died in 1923, and she married Allen Campbell in 1925. Harriet passed away in July 1975 at the age of 90. Albert James Hay served at least 10 years of his 15-year sentence, according to prison records. He was written up and punished for multiple infractions, the most serious being found with a razor blade in his possession, which he refused to turn over when ordered. The last entry of the record was August 1919, when he was discharged from Pentridge, the old Melbourne jail. There is some confusion about what happened afterward. Between 1919 through the 1930s, electoral rolls show one James Hay, Annie Hay, wife, and Hannah Hay, his mother, living together at various addresses in Melbourne and Northcote. In each entry, James Hay lists his occupation as a blacksmith striker. Did Albert Hay use his middle name to hide his identity as a murderer and convict? There are two mysteries surrounding the identity of this family. First, the marriage between James Hay and Annie Peters occurred in 1913 while Albert was still in prison. Second, the records listing James Hay on the electoral rolls continued until 1938, at least 4 years after his death, which was recorded to have been on July 8, 1934. He is buried at Faulkner Memorial Park, Marybeck City, Victoria. Martha Eltze Cox, the ancestress catalyst for this investigation, moved away from Horsham to escape her notoriety. In about 1912, she married Frederick Broadwood in Leongatha. He was the father of 5 children. However, an interesting notice in the New South Wales Police Gazette on October 3, 1903 stated, quote, "Missing. Inquiry is requested at the instance of the State Children's Department, Adelaide, South Australia, as to the whereabouts of Frederick Broadwood, whose children are under state control and towards whose support he is required to contribute. He is 42 years of age, 6 feet high, dark complexion, dark or nearly black hair, whiskers inclined to be sandy, blue eyes, large, straight nose, rather round shoulders, last heard of at Digby, Victoria. Is supposed to have come to New South Wales and to be employed shearing on some station." End of article. Apparently, Martha was attracted to bad boys. Broadwood died in 1938 of heart failure and was buried in Staywell. In 1945, Martha married Ernest Lancaster, a recent widower with 6 grown children. She passed away from heart failure in November 1955 at the Staywell District Hospital at the age of 77. Her third husband died the following year. Martha was buried in an unmarked grave in the Staywell Cemetery next to her second husband, Fred Broadwood. Her death record shows only 2 marriages, with no mention of Edward Cox. Martha Eltze's siblings must have been scandalized by the notoriety of their sister's plight. The story of the murder in the family was whispered through the generations, and the question remained about how much guilt she bore in the murder. It is impossible to say for certain today, but given all the witness testimony and evidence, it is most likely that she was a young woman married to a boring older man. Having the attention of Hay, a younger, charismatic man, must have been exhilarating. How far the relationship had gone or was destined to go can only be speculated. However, it is clear that Edward Cox ignored what would appear obvious to most, in that allowing Hay around his wife, particularly in a drunken state, could only lead to disaster. Martha was flirting with danger, and on July 12, 1909, it finally erupted into murder. Her quest to protect Albert Hay demonstrated she probably was in love with him and maybe felt guilty about her part in encouraging him. Thank you for listening to this episode of A Murder in the Family, Edward Boothby Cox. The research on this story was particularly challenging since I am unfamiliar with the names and places in Australia, and I am certain I have slaughtered the pronunciations. Nevertheless, I am grateful to Geni and her father, Mark Kelepouris, for suggesting the story, and especially for all the help they gave me. I hope I was able to do it justice. Please remember to follow me on Facebook at Old Fashioned Murder and Mayhem for updates on stories and additional information. I've had a few other suggestions for stories and will be trying to dig up information on those as soon as possible. We are nearing 4,000 subscribers from all over the world, which blows my mind. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. It helps the channel grow. And join me again next month for another episode of Old Fashioned Murder and Mayhem.